in the highest reaches of the Himalayas, where clouds kiss ancient stone and prayers drift like smoke into forgotten skies, there are places where time no longer flows forward. Welcome to Whispers of Asia, a place where old spirits breathe through rituals still whispered in the wind, where folklore is not just memory, but a warning. Here, we tell stories buried in the soil of sacred mountains. We speak of traditions too old to trace and terrors too patient to die. These are not just tales, they are echoes of rituals that still tremble beneath the earth. Tonight's story is one of grief, of mercy turned into a summoning, and of bells that ring long after the dead should rest. So light your lantern, lock your doors, and listen closely. When the bell rings after burial, it's not for the dead, it's an invitation for the living. High above the tree lines, where the wind carries the sound of ancient prayers through hollows carved by ice and time, there lies a village untouched by maps. They call it Jumra Pass, a place nestled so deeply in the bones of the Himalayas that even the sun must fight to reach it. The villagers live as their ancestors once did, wrapped in furs, warming their hands with yak butter tea, and bowing their heads when the earth growls beneath them. But they do more than just survive. They remember. They remember the stories that don't belong to bedtime, the ones not meant to soothe children to sleep, but to keep them awake. Stories that curl behind your ears like a cold breath in the dark. Stories that stain silence with something heavier than fear. At the heart of one such story is a brass bell, small, unremarkable, tarnished by time. It is not meant to ring in celebration. It is tied to the dead. Long ago, when medicine was superstition and death was a question, the villagers practiced a rite, one both compassionate and cruel. They called it Karuna Ganti, the mercy bell. When someone died, before the grave was sealed, the elders would tie a thin string to a small bell and place it in the coffin, the end of the string knotted gently to the wrist of the deceased. A mercy, they said, in case the body still held breath, in case the soul had not yet left. The bell would be buried alongside the dead, and for 3 nights, someone, usually an elder or a novice monk, would take shifts near the grave, listening, watching, waiting for the faintest sound, one soft chime in the dark. It rarely rang, and when it did, it was already too late. The string would tighten, the bell would shake, but by the time the grave was opened, what was found was not relief, but horror. Fingers bloodied from clawing, mouths agape in frozen screams, faces turned upward, away from peace. Those who were saved were never truly saved. They returned broken, touched by the other side, haunted by things that clung to them like frost. So over time, the villagers buried the practice itself. No more strings, no more bells, no more half-dead returning with whispers in their eyes. But traditions have a way of staying buried only until the earth is ready to speak again. And the earth did speak. One winter, heavier than any before it, brought with it a landslide that tore through the old quarter of Jumra Pass, where the first cemetery lay. Graves older than memory were split open like wounds. Wooden markers shattered. Bones kissed the cold light of day for the first time in centuries. At first, the villagers wept. Then they listened. Because after the landslide, the bells began to ring. Not just once, not in one place, but everywhere. Beneath the broken soil, beneath graves that never had strings, bells that should have rusted into silence. At first, it was dismissed. Mountain wind, metal shifting under pressure, the mind playing tricks in grief. But then, people began to dream of bells and wake with dirt beneath their nails. The village healer, Amanima, was the first to say it out loud. They are not asking to be rescued. They are calling someone else down, she whispered, staring into the smoke of her herbal bowl. The villagers stopped speaking of mercy because the bell was no longer a kindness. It had become a summons. On the third night, after every new burial, the bell tied to the corpse's hand would ring, even if there was no string, even if no bell had been buried at all. The sound was soft, yet it pierced the soul, like a lullaby sung in a tongue no longer known, like something that shouldn't exist but always has. Those who heard it the clearest were not the mourners. They were the strangers, the drifters, the ones whose roots were shallow in Jumra soil. And they began to walk in their sleep. Feet bare, eyes closed, mouths murmuring names no one remembered. They would be found in the morning near the edges of the graveyard, kneeling in front of broken stones, nails packed with soil, skin etched with scratches like they'd tried to dig, not to escape, but to enter. The village council tried to act. They burned incense, chanted protection prayers, even exhumed the most active graves. But nothing stopped the ringing. It did not come from the bells. It came from below. And every time they buried someone new, they knew exactly which night it would begin. The third night. Always the third. A boy named Pemba was the first to speak of what he saw. He was 10. His mother died of fever, and her grave was sealed with no rites, no bell, no string. But Pemba heard the bell, and he followed it. They found him standing over her grave, his hand stretched out like a branch bending in wind, fingers twitching with rhythm. When they tried to pull him away, he screamed not in fear, but in hunger. "She's calling me," he sobbed, his voice scraping like old rock. "She says it's warm down there." After that night, Pemba no longer spoke. He just listened, always listening. It was Amanima who said the words everyone else feared. The bell is no longer a question. It is an answer. And in that moment, the village understood something chilling. The dead were not trapped. They were not begging to come back. They were reaching up, fingers outstretched, inviting the living to join them in the soil. Not out of malice, not out of hatred, but something worse. Longing. For the silence beneath, for the cold that holds, for the endless lull of earth and time. Now, every time the bell rings, someone disappears. Not always right away. Sometimes it takes weeks. but the ground always gets what it calls for. So, in Jumra Pass, the villagers stopped tying bells to the dead, because the bell no longer waits for permission. It rings anyway. The mountains don't roar in anger. They murmur, they whisper, and when they finally move, they do so with a patience that makes the earth forget it was ever still. It had been a heavy winter in Jumra Pass, the kind that made the air burn in your lungs and your breath hang like ghosts in the dark. Snow clung to roofs like a second skin, and icicles hung from prayer flags like sharpened teeth. The villagers had grown quiet, their routines shortened by frost, their voices muffled beneath wool and worry. Then came the thaw. A rare warmth crawled up the cliffs like a serpent with golden breath, melting what should have lasted months. The snow softened, the ground loosened, and the mountain shifted, not with violence, but with weight, with purpose. It began just after dusk, when the sky was turning violet and the first prayer drums had stilled. A low rumble rolled through the valley, like the grumble of an old god disturbed from sleep. The earth trembled, not in panic, but in warning. Then came the sound, like stones weeping, like the mountain itself cracking open to remember something it had tried to forget. The landslide struck the eastern ridge of Jumra Pass, the oldest part of the village, where the homes leaned like tired elders and the graves lined the cliffs like forgotten footprints. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. The weight of centuries pressed down, pushing rocks, soil, wood, and bone into a single slow-motion collapse. When the dust settled, 24 homes were gone. So were the paths, the statues, the shrines, and the cemetery. It wasn't just disturbed, it was spilled. Coffins cracked open like ribs, stones rolled down like dislodged teeth, and bones, human bones, lay scattered like kindling along the new wound in the earth. No one spoke for a long time. Even the monks were silent. The villagers gathered at dawn, wrapped in grief and layers of smoke. Some prayed, some wept, some stood as if waiting for the mountain to apologize. But Amanyima did not look at the destruction. She looked at the bells. There were dozens, maybe more. Some rusted, some polished like they had never been buried. They lay among the shattered graves, still tied to rotting strings. Others had no string at all, just nestled in the soil like seeds. Some rested inside skulls. Some were wrapped in broken hands. None had rung during the slide. But that night, they began. The first chime came just after midnight, a soft tink, like a spoon brushing porcelain. Then another, then 3 more. Soon it was as if a small choir had gathered beneath the rubble, singing a lullaby made only of brass and breathless air. They rang in rhythm, but no one could find the source. The villagers tried to dig, to gather the bells, to seal the graves. But every time they touched one, the air grew heavy, like they'd stepped into a room where someone had just died. Their fingers stiffened, their ears rang. Some collapsed, and the bells kept ringing. Only at night, always on the windless nights. By the end of the week, 5 villagers had left, packed what little they could, and vanished down the mountain trail without a word. Amanyima did not stop them. She said they are not cowards. They are not abandoning us. They are choosing silence. For the rest, life became ritual. Fires burned constantly. Salt was thrown at every threshold. Children were forbidden to walk near the ridge. But the bells ignored all of it. They didn't care for fences or prayers. They rang anyway. Then came the dreams. It started with a girl named Sarki. She was 17, the daughter of the stonemason who had died in the landslide. On the 7th night, she woke up screaming, her hands clenched into claws, her mouth filled with dirt. They found her near the ruins, barefoot, muttering a name no one recognized. Jendo, Jendo, Jendo. The name wasn't from their village. It wasn't even from their dialect. Others followed. A widow named Tashi was found whispering to the trees. A monk stared at a bell for 12 hours straight, refusing to blink. And always, after the 3rd night of each new burial, the bell would ring. No matter how deep they dug, no matter how well they sealed the coffin, no matter if no bell had been buried at all, the sound would come, soft, mournful. Then the dreams would begin, then the walking. The graves, it seemed, were no longer final. But it wasn't just the newly dead. Some villagers began having visions of faces they'd never seen, faces from generations past, wearing robes no longer worn, carrying tools no longer used, and behind each of them, a hand, pale, soil-stained, holding a bell. Amayima searched the temple scrolls, the old scriptures, the forbidden texts hidden beneath the altar stones, and she found fragments, warnings more than answers. When the bell is heard without breath, the mountain calls back what it buried in flesh. No one knew who had written it, but everyone understood. This was no haunting. This was summoning. The landslide had not been an accident. It had been an opening. A door creaking back into place, not into the underworld, but into memory, into debt. The village had buried many things over the centuries, not just the dead. Secrets, shames, oaths broken in silence. And now the mountain had remembered. The bells were not calling for help. They were calling the balance due. By the end of that month, 2 more villagers vanished. No struggle, no footprints, just gone. Only one thing left behind, a soft ringing in the air and dirt in their empty beds.
It began with the smallest vibration, not in the air, not in the trees, but in the earth. Jumra Pass had long been a place where the ground spoke in silence. The villagers had grown up reading tremors like language, the way a teacup rattled on its saucer, or how the prayer stones tilted ever so slightly in their piles. They knew the difference between a shifting rock and a warning from below. But this was different. The soil didn't shake, it shivered, as if something underneath was sighing or breathing. It started around the newest graves, a faint hum, too low to hear with the ears, but the bones noticed. You could feel it when you sat too long on the ground, when your fingers brushed the dirt, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to you. At first, they blamed the thaw, the shifting of water under layers of old frost, the weight of melt dragging ancient roots out of place. But then, the bells rang. Not the ones tied to the dead, those had stopped. Now, it was the soil itself that chimed.
One evening, an old woman named Dorima was tending to her prayer flags near the ruined cemetery. She'd spent her entire life tending the dead, washing bodies, lighting incense, murmuring the final chants. Her hands knew the shape of death, the way a potter knows clay. That night, she felt a coldness bloom beneath her knees as she knelt. Not wind, not snow, something deeper. And then she heard it, a muffled chime from beneath her feet. She thought her ears were betraying her, so she pressed her palm to the ground. The sound came again, a bell, not loud, not bright, distant, echoing, alive. She staggered back, clutching her chest. The ground, she whispered later, had spoken to her, and it had teeth. That night, the soil sang across the village. People reported hearing bells beneath their beds, beneath the floorboards, in the spaces between their dreams and waking. The sound wasn't metal anymore. It was bone against stone. It was the friction of memory rising. In the morning, fresh footprints were found in the snow around the graves, barefoot, thin, as if made by someone who had been dead for a long time and no longer cared for warmth. Then came the names. Villagers began whispering names in their sleep, names they had never spoken before, names long erased from temple scrolls, names that hadn't been chanted in rituals for hundreds of years. Even the monks could no longer deny it. The soil was remembering, and it was asking the living to do the same. Amma Nima held a gathering at the temple, the incense thick as fog, her voice barely more than a breath. She did not speak in alarm. She did not demand silence. She only asked one question. What did we bury that now rings for us? No one answered, but everyone knew something had been forgotten, something that did not want to stay forgotten. In the following days, the villagers made offerings, salt, fire, prayer wheels spun with desperate hands. But it changed nothing. The bells continued, and with them came the whispers. Not loud, not even fully formed, just syllables curling behind the ears like someone calling your name from another room. Those who listened too long began to lose things, simple things, names, days, the order of thoughts. It started with forgetfulness and ended in silence. One man, Dorje, wandered into the temple at dusk and sat beneath the large bell without speaking. When they tried to move him, he resisted, eyes glazed like mountain glass. "It's quieter here," he said. "They don't reach as far when I'm beneath the big one." He died 2 nights later, with dirt packed under his tongue and a brass bell clenched in his hand, one no one had ever seen before. Amma Nima prepared his body herself, but when she tried to clean his hands, the bell would not release. His fingers had fused around it, as if his body had decided to carry it with him to wherever he was going. That night, 5 bells rang beneath the village, and 5 villagers sleepwalked toward the edge of the landslide. They were stopped, just barely, but in their eyes was recognition, as if the graves were not foreign to them, as if they had been called home. The council convened again, faces lined with fear. They spoke of old texts, of forbidden rites, of the reversal, a ritual so ancient and dangerous that it had only ever been mentioned once, carved into a single prayer wheel in a now lost dialect. But the whispers grew louder before any decision could be made. And then something unthinkable happened. The soil rang during the day. It was midday, bright and bitter, when the sound pierced the village, a clear, sharp chime that came from every direction at once. Children cried, dogs howled, the air itself felt like it recoiled. And from the edge of the cemetery, a crack opened in the earth. Just a hairline fracture, but wide enough for one thing to emerge. A single hand, dry, blue-gray, not decayed, but ancient, wrapped loosely around a string. And at the end of that string was a bell. It did not move, it did not chime, but everyone who saw it knew it had already rung.
There is something sacred about the number 3 in Jumra Pass. 3 knots in a mourning sash. 3 days of fasting after a death. 3 incense sticks burned before the soul is sent off with prayer. 3 nights to make peace with the dead. But now, that sacred number had turned into something else. A countdown, a warning, a curse. It did not matter who died or how, whether it was illness, age, or accident, whether the body was buried deep beneath the frost or cremated in fire. The 3rd night always came, and so did the sound. The villagers began to track it. The pattern was too exact, too deliberate. On the 1st night, there was silence. On the 2nd, a tension in the air, the kind that made birds quiet, the kind that made wind hold its breath. And on the 3rd, the bell rang, always, no exceptions. The first time they noticed the rhythm, it was with a boy named Tsering. He was 10 years old, full of questions, obsessed with stories. When he died from a fever, the grief was sharp and unbearable. His mother wept so deeply, the prayer beads in her hands snapped, scattering across the temple floor like tiny bones. They buried him under the old cedar tree, where the soil was softer and the snow never seemed to linger. On the 1st night, the wind rustled gently. His mother lit a lamp by his photo. On the 2nd, she heard whispers, soft, like the lullabies she used to sing. And on the 3rd, the bell rang. No string had been tied, no bell had been placed, but it rang, clear, sweet, and playful. The next morning, the cedar tree had bloomed out of season. Its bark was sticky with sap, and carved into its side, scratched crudely by a child's hand, was a name, his own. Since that day, the village had measured time differently. They no longer counted days in weeks or moons. They counted in 3s, in deaths, in the space between goodbye and the 1st ring. Soon, it wasn't just sound, it was behavior. On the 3rd night, people would begin to act wrong. It began small. A man boiling water forgot to stop. A woman laughed during a funeral and didn't know why. A child stood facing a wall for hours. And then the sleepwalking began, but only on the 3rd night. Bodies rose from their mats and walked, eyes closed, faces serene. They walked toward graves, even ones they had never visited. They muttered names not their own. One girl, Pema, was found at sunrise kneeling in the snow, hands buried in the soil of a stranger's grave. Her fingertips were raw, her lips were blue. She told me to dig,
She said it was my turn. Pema had never met the woman buried there. She had died decades before the girl was born. Amanima, who had once guided the dying across the final threshold with peace, now sat alone at the temple each third night, muttering protection prayers that no longer felt like shields. Her voice had grown hoarse, her fingers trembled. She stopped wearing her ceremonial bells. She no longer trusted their sound, because now it was impossible to know which bell was hers and which came from beneath the ground. The council met in secret. The old leader, Dorje Rinzen, proposed a brutal solution. He said, "Burn the dead, scatter the ashes in the river, let nothing remain to ring." But the monks resisted. They said, "A body burned without ritual is a soul unanchored, and the soil still remembers." Still, desperation won. They tried burning the body of the next villager to pass, a woman named Lamhu, who died peacefully in her sleep. They followed every rule, every chant. Her ashes were scattered with reverence. But on the third night, the bells still rang. Not in the cemetery, in the river. The surface of the water shimmered strangely. The current had stopped, and from beneath the stones came the muffled tink, tink, tink. By morning, the river had flooded its banks, soaking the roots of the prayer trees. They tried isolation. They tried prayer. They even tried salt circles and iron talismans, but the bells ignored them. It became clear that the curse was not in the body, not in the soil, but in the number itself. The third night had become a sacred threshold, a veil thinning, not torn, but gently parted like a curtain pulled back to let something step through. And what came through was not always the dead. One evening, a traveler arrived, a man from the south who claimed to be a scholar of forgotten rituals. His name was Nawang, and he carried scrolls written in languages so old the ink had faded into the fibers. He had heard of Jumra Pass. He had studied the Karunai Ganti, the mercy bell. But what he spoke of chilled the room. He said, "You think the bell was for mercy, but it was never meant to save. It was meant to mark." He unrolled a scroll that showed a crude drawing, a corpse with a bell tied to its hand, and a second bell drawn above the body, floating in the air. He said, "The living tied the first bell, but the second bell, that was always the answer." Nawan believed the third night was a covenant, an ancient pact struck long before the villagers could remember, that the bell was a form of invitation, a chime that echoed across the realms, calling not the soul upward, but something else downward. He said, "Every time it rings, a door opens." The villagers asked what they could do. He answered simply, "Stop burying, stop naming, stop listening." But it was too late for all three. By then, the soil had already memorized every name ever whispered in grief. The graves knew the footsteps of every mourner, and the bells had grown bold. They no longer waited for death. They rang for the living, and always on the third night.
The freeze returned late that year. After the thaw had opened the graves, after the landslide had awakened old bones, the cold crept back in with quiet vengeance. Not a blizzard, not a storm, just a silent reclaiming of the village by frost. At first, the villagers were relieved. The snow hardened the soil, the graves froze shut, the ringing faded. But peace in Jumra Pass never lasted long. The cold did not silence the dead, it preserved them. The ground became hard as stone. Ice crystallized across rooftops, along windows, inside shoes left too close to the door. The river stopped flowing, the prayer flag stiffened in place, and breath turned to mist, even indoors. Still, it was better than the bells, until the ice began to speak. It started with the lake. There was a small, still lake behind the ridge, known as Mirror's Edge, where the elders once said souls paused before crossing. No one fished there, no one bathed. It was too cold, too deep, too quiet. But one morning, a boy named Rinzin wandered out onto it, barefoot in the snow, his eyes glazed and locked on the horizon. He walked halfway across the frozen surface before collapsing, face pressed to the ice. When they reached him, he was mumbling. Not words, names. Names none of them recognized. Names he should not have known. His mother wept and tried to wake him, but he only pointed downward. "They're under there," he whispered, listening. From then on, no one went near the lake. But others began to hear things. Not bells, not whispers, but full voices. From beneath the ice, beneath the soil, beneath their beds. And always the same tone, calm, kind, familiar. The kind of voice that didn't scare you, the kind that invited you closer. One woman, Dolma, claimed her dead husband called to her every night, not in dreams, in the quiet before dawn. She would wake and hear him from under the floorboards, asking her to come walk with him. Just one step, just a moment. She resisted until she didn't. On the third night, they found her gone. No footprints in the snow, no broken door. Only an open window, and a trail of melted ice leading down the path toward Mirror's Edge. When the sun rose, the lake had cracked. Not across the surface, from beneath, as if something had tapped from the other side. The monks gathered at the temple and lit hundreds of butter lamps. The wind did not blow, but the flames flickered sideways, drawn toward the east, toward the lake, toward the cemetery. Amanima stood before them, no longer a healer, but a sentinel of something far older. She said, "They no longer ring because they no longer need to. We've already heard them." The bells were just the beginning. Now the voices were reaching through, and with them came memory. Villagers began to remember things they had never lived, dreams of ancient rituals, of old languages spoken through their mouths in sleep, of funerals lit by blue fire and bells made not of brass but bone. The memories bled into waking life. One child, Sonam, drew a perfect diagram of a burial pattern not used in centuries. When asked where she learned it, she simply said, "They showed me in the frost." Another man spoke fluently in a dialect no one recognized, not even the scholar Nawang. He called it the tongue of ice, and his voice sounded doubled, like someone else was speaking with him. The snow around Jumra Pass became treacherous, not because of depth, but because of what lay beneath. The ice cracked in straight lines, circles, runes. At night, it pulsed faintly, not with light, but with heat, as if something below was getting closer,
warming the veil, preparing to step through. Amanima climbed to the edge of the cemetery and knelt in silence. She placed her hands on the frozen soil and whispered the names of the first dead, the ones buried before even her grandmother's time. And then she listened. For hours she knelt, until her lips cracked and her skin numbed. Then finally she rose, slowly, as if carrying the weight that couldn't be seen. She said, "They are not trapped, they are waiting." The villagers asked what for. She did not answer. That night, for the first time in weeks, the bells returned. Not beneath the ground, but suspended in the trees, tied with old strings, swaying in windless air. No one had put them there. They rang at midnight, one after another, and beneath the sound came the low hum of voices beneath the ice, layered, mournful, patient. They weren't screaming, they weren't angry, they were calling. By morning, all the bells in the trees had vanished. Only the strings remained, frayed, frozen, and reaching downward into the snow. Before the landslide, the dead of Jumra Pass were remembered with stones. Small ones, carved ones, some with names etched in old Tibetan script, others with only symbols, a line, a curve, a spiral, passed down from the time before words held meaning. But as the graves cracked open and the bells rang, the stones no longer seemed enough, because something else began to write back. It started with the children. They played in the narrow lanes after morning chores, their fingers leaving trails in the dust as children do. But those trails started to mean something. They began to draw names, not their own, not those of friends or family, but names none of them could explain, names no one taught them, names that hadn't been spoken in generations. One girl, Choden, was found crouched near the village well, humming softly while she drew the same set of letters into the dry dirt again and again. Her fingers were bleeding, not from force, but from repetition. When her father called her name, she didn't respond. When he touched her shoulder, she looked up and said, "This is the name of the one I used to be." After that, the village paths were never clean. Every morning, names appeared overnight, some written with bare fingers, some with sticks, some scrawled like frantic scribbles, others drawn in perfect loops, as if etched by a master calligrapher. They were found on walls, in ashes, across the frozen panes of windows, always new, always ancient. The monks tried to catalog them. Nawang, the scholar, helped, cross-referencing each against his skulls. Many were lost names, forgotten ancestors, travelers who died in the mountains, or those who had been buried without ritual during old famines and plagues. But some names had never belonged to humans. They were too long, too heavy, too old. Amanima sat before a large spiral drawn in charcoal behind the temple. She studied it for hours, unmoving, lips parted but silent. When asked what it said, she replied without looking away. This name was buried before the first grave. This one remembers us. And then the pattern changed. No longer just names of the dead, but names of the living, names of villagers who were still alive, but would not be for long. It began with Norbu, the baker. His name appeared one morning in the center of the courtyard, spelled in salt. No one claimed to have written it. He laughed it off. Maybe the dead want my bread. That night, the oven exploded. They found him beneath the rubble, bones broken, eyes wide, his hands still covered in flour. The bell rang for him anyway. 3 nights later, exactly as expected. Then came Dawa, the midwife. Her name was carved into the frost on the inside of her window, from the inside. She was dead by morning. A fall, they said, though there were no bruises, no blood, only frozen fingers and a faint chime still echoing in her cottage. Panic took hold. The villagers began washing every surface, scrubbing floors, erasing marks, but the names returned. They always returned. They rose through the dust. They pressed through the wood. They bloomed in mold across the walls. You could not escape them. You could only hope your name wasn't next. One child refused to sleep after finding his name etched into the underside of his blanket. He clutched a talisman, wept through the night. He survived, but the blanket was gone the next morning, and so was his voice. He would never speak again. Nawang proposed a theory that the names were not threats, they were invitations, or perhaps reminders. If you are named, it is because something has chosen you, and maybe something once was you. Amanima believed otherwise. These names are not written by hands, they are written by memory. The ground remembers the weight of every soul, and now it's reaching back. They began to see handprints too, not just footprints in the snow, but clear, deliberate impressions in the dirt. Small, large, twisted, too many fingers, fingers that had dug through soil to sign their names, not to be known, but to claim, to stake ownership, to return. One evening, the temple bell rang without wind. Amanima stepped outside and found a circle of names drawn around its base, all the names of the monks still living. Each of them heard the same voice that night, not aloud, but in dreams, a single sentence. You have forgotten where you belong. Come home. The monks packed their things at dawn. No prayers, no ceremony. They simply walked down the mountain trail, heads bowed, refusing to look back. Only one monk stayed behind. He was deaf. And that night, not a single name appeared. But the dirt outside the temple was wet, as if something beneath had cried. It began without thunder, without screams, without any warning at all. Just footsteps, soft, bare, moving over frozen earth like snow that walks. Jumra Pass had grown quieter in recent weeks, not out of peace, but out of fatigue. Grief hung low over every rooftop. The bells had fallen silent again, but not because the dead were resting. It was because they had been heard. The villagers had grown used to signs, names in the dirt, voices in the frost, bells ringing from nowhere. But what happened on that night was not a sign. It was a shift. The boundary between the living and the dead was no longer sacred. It had been crossed. It started with Dorje's youngest son, Palki. Just 12 years old, quiet, sensitive, afraid of everything, even the dark. But that night, he walked. At first, his parents thought he was still asleep. He moved so gently. His eyes were open, but blank, glazed over with something ancient. His feet made no sound even on the cold wooden floor. They whispered his name. He didn't flinch. They called louder. He didn't stop. When Dorje tried to grab him, Palki turned and smiled. But it wasn't his smile. It was stretched too wide, empty in the middle, a mimicry of joy worn by something that had never felt it. He left the house without shoes, without coat, and began walking up the ridge toward the graves. Dorje chased after him. The snow was deep, but Palki moved as if it wasn't there, as if the land remembered him or had always been his. Half the village followed. Torches, footsteps, prayers muttered under breath. They feared the worst, but what they found was worse still. Palki wasn't alone. 6 others were already there, all walking, all barefoot, some children, some elders, some who had never even seen the graves before. They circled the old cemetery silently, slowly, like dancers following a rhythm no one else could hear. Their heads tilted at the same angle, their eyes blank, their lips moved in sync, but no sound came out. Only one phrase lingered in the air, barely louder than the wind. I remember, I remember, I remember. Then, suddenly, they all stopped. Each of them knelt front of a different grave, not their families, not recent, random, or so it seemed. And in one motion, they pressed their hands into the snow and began to dig. Not fast, not frantic, calm, precise. Dorje tried to stop his son. He shouted, pleaded, cried, but Palki didn't react. Only when Dorje grabbed his arm did Palki look up and speak. I'm not ready to wake yet. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed. So did the others. The villagers carried them back in silence. Not one of the walkers remembered anything, not the cold, not the grave, not even their names. Just one thing lingered in every one of them, under their fingernails: soil. The next morning, Amanima visited each one. She asked them not what they remembered, but who. Each child, each elder, each sleepwalker whispered a name that had been written in the dirt days before, a name the earth had already claimed. And with that, the truth became clear. The walk was not possession, it was recognition. Something beneath had reached upward and found itself in them. Nawang, the scholar, called it a mirroring. The dead no longer wait for grief. They find pieces of themselves in the living, and they walk. He believed it was not a curse, but an ancient rite long forgotten, a way for the dead to remember who they were, through us. But Amanima disagreed. This is not memory. This is return. She had seen this once before, when she was a girl, during a winter so long ago no one else remembered, when a woman in the village had begun walking at night, whispering songs in an extinct language, smiling at things that weren't there. 3 days later, she vanished, and in her place, a new bell rang from under the floorboards of the temple. The villagers never spoke of it until now. This was not the first walk, only the first they had recognized. After that night, walking became common. Every third night, more people joined the silent procession, no matter how young, no matter how far. One man returned after walking barefoot over 10 kilometers of frozen ridge. His feet were blue, but he didn't feel anything. The line between waking and walking blurred. People tied themselves to furniture. Parents took turns watching their children through the night. Some tried sleeping in shifts. Others stopped sleeping altogether. But it didn't matter, because the ones who were chosen would always walk, even with open eyes, even fully awake. One afternoon, a boy stopped mid-step in the middle of the village square and simply turned and began to walk straight into the trees, stone-eyed, silent. He was found 3 hours later, standing in a stream, hands outstretched to nothing, whispering, "I found where I was." Amanima stood before the elders once again. The bells were the call, the names were the invitation, the walking is the answer. The village had changed. There were no more prayers for safety, only for clarity. No more offerings for the dead, only recognition. Because now, when the villagers saw someone walking toward the graves, they did not ask, "What is happening to them?" They asked, "Who is returning through them?"
They no longer called it sleepwalking. Not after what came next. What walked through the village at night were not simply people lost in dreams. They were vessels, carriers, shadows that had forgotten how to cast light. They came in silence, not like ghosts, but like echoes searching for their original sound. Their movements were slow, yet purposeful. Their eyes were always open, but unfocused. Not blind, only unanchored. The villagers began calling them hollow ones. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Because those who walked weren't always the same when they came back. At first, it was subtle. Someone would return from a midnight walk and sit at their doorstep for hours, staring at the cemetery without blinking. A child would speak words far too old for their age, archaic phrases spoken in tones not quite their own. An elder would forget their children's names, but recall with perfect clarity the layout of a graveyard that hadn't existed for 200 years. It was as if their memories had been rearranged, not erased, just replaced. Amanima was the first to say it aloud. They come back with someone else's silence inside them. One woman, Tsering Dolma, began humming an old funeral song, one that hadn't been sung in Jumra Pass since the plague era. She had never learned it. No one had. When asked how she knew the melody, she looked confused. "I don't. It just feels like it was waiting in my throat." The hollow ones were always calm when they returned, too calm, as if the storm had passed through them and left nothing standing. They didn't cry, they didn't ask questions. They simply resumed their lives, but wrong. A boy who used to be left-handed suddenly wrote with his right. A girl who hated fish now ate it raw in silence. An old man who feared death began building his own coffin, humming. They were fragments of the living, of the dead, of something in between. The villagers began marking them, not openly, not with shame, but with caution. A black thread tied around the wrist, a small bell placed in their coat pocket, not to protect them, but to warn the rest when they moved, because sometimes they walked in daylight.
It happened one morning as the sun broke over the mountain. A group of hollow ones gathered at the base of the prayer hill. No words, no commands. They simply stood in formation, facing east, heads tilted slightly upward, eyes glazed. And then they sang, not in unison, but in layers. Their voices wove together, a low, droning chant in a language no living soul knew. It was not human. It was not melodic. It was remembered. People wept as they listened, not because it was beautiful, but because it felt like the sound of being forgotten by the world. After 10 minutes, they stopped, turned, walked back to their homes as if nothing had happened. One man tried to follow them, tried to speak to his wife who had been among them. She looked at him and asked, "Do I live here?" He didn't answer, because her voice was hers, but the eyes were not. Amanyima called a gathering that night. The temple was crowded. Smoke from incense clung to every robe, every face. She stood before them all, holding a small cracked bell in her hands. Its clapper was missing. "These people are not possessed," she said softly. "They are shared." Gasps followed. A piece of someone, something, somewhere else has found its way inside them. Not to harm, not to haunt, but to remember itself through living flesh. Nawang added his theory. Memory needs a host, and the hollow ones are vessels of old grief. He believed the walking, the chanting, the subtle shifts were all attempts by the forgotten dead to become real again. Not spirits, not demons, but identities without homes, rootless memories trying to root themselves again. The villagers didn't know what to believe. They only knew the hollow ones were growing in number, and each one took a little longer to return to who they were, if they ever did. Soon the village began keeping 2 sets of records, one for the living and one for those who were unsure. The hollow list, they called it. It was hidden beneath the altar, updated every week. It held names, dates of first walks, behavioral changes, what was remembered and what was forgotten. By the end of the month, there were 17 names, then 21, then 33. Each time, Amanyima would light a small candle next to the record and whisper, "If you must return through them, be gentle." But not all were. One night, a hollow one screamed, not in fear, but in rage. It came from the tailor's home. His son had begun walking days before, quiet and gentle like the rest, but that night he turned violent. He tore down the family shrine, smashed his own mirror, carved a spiral into his chest with a piece of broken bell. When they restrained him, he laughed. "This body is too small. I was never meant to fit inside it." He didn't walk again after that, but he never spoke again either. Only sat, eyes wide, mouth always slightly open, as if still listening, still waiting. From that day forward, the villagers stopped calling them hollow ones. They began to call them hosts, and some feared the day would come when no one left in Jumra Pass was just themselves anymore.
It began with the voices, not the ones from under the soil. These were different. These came from within. The hosts, once just sleepwalkers, now vessels of something far older, had started speaking in tongues no one recognized. Not Tibetan, not Nepali, not any language found in Nawang's scrolls. The words were breathy, circular, strange. They echoed without volume, like chants heard underwater. Sometimes they muttered them during meals, sometimes while staring into fire, and sometimes while watching someone who had not yet walked. The villagers grew uneasy, not just because the words were foreign, but because of what they felt like: worship. Amanyima was the first to notice the pattern. The hosts, when speaking these old tongues, always faced east, always looked toward the graves. And when asked what they were saying, some would smile, confused. "I'm not sure," one whispered, "but it feels like I'm remembering a prayer." One elderly host, Yonten, spent an entire day carving symbols into the bark of the sacred tree. His hands bled, but he didn't stop. When he collapsed at the base of the trunk, he muttered with his last breath, "They're listening now. The ones before names, the ones who came before mercy." That night, the bells rang again. But this time, they did not ring from beneath. They rang from the sky. High, shimmering tones, like metal vibrating in cold air, impossible to place. No visible source, no movement, just sound, echoing between stars. And underneath that sound, the voices rose. Every host in the village began to hum, not in fear, in reverence. They gathered outside, like a congregation, their eyes fixed on nothing, their mouths open in silent praise. Some even knelt, and Amanyima understood. These are not ghosts, these are remnants of gods. Not the gods from scripture, not the ones from temples or chants, older ones, forgotten ones. First names carved in the dirt long before graves were marked. Gods that bled into the land when the mountains were still waking. Gods that had no form, only memory, only vibration. The villagers began hearing their names spoken in the hosts' mutterings, but not their full names, only the bones of them, stripped down to the sound of belonging. Kin, burial, come, return. It was no longer about death, it was about rejoining. Nawang translated what little he could. He believed these gods had been forgotten not because they were unworthy, but because they wanted to be. Buried beneath earth and time, sealed in graves too deep for memory, kept silent by rituals of mercy. But now the bells had awakened them, and through the mouths of the hosts they were teaching again, teaching a tongue no longer human, teaching devotion without religion, only memory, only sound. Symbols began appearing around the village, drawn in soot, carved into doors, stitched into clothing. At first they were hidden, but then they became ritual. The hosts would chant before eating, wash their hands with ash instead of water, sit in circles and press their foreheads to the ground. And always, always, they spoke in the old tongue, a language no one had taught them. The children learned it fastest. They began drawing spirals in the snow, speaking to the trees, answering questions with riddles that felt like prayers. One child, when asked who taught him the words, replied without blinking, "The one whose bell never stopped ringing." When Amanyima asked what that meant, he pointed toward the eastern ridge,
to a spot where no grave had ever been, just a patch of ground the color of ash, always dry, always warm. She went there alone, and when she pressed her hand to the dirt, she heard it. A heartbeat. Not hers, not the earth's. Something older, still buried, still dreaming. She told no one, but from that day on, she began wearing black, even on holy days. The villagers stopped calling the hosts by their names, not out of fear, out of reverence. They were becoming something else, something in between priest and vessel, between mourner and monument. And in their presence, even the wind sounded like a voice, whispering forgotten syllables, inviting the living to remember a truth that could no longer be avoided. The gods were not coming back. They had never left. They had just been buried, alive in silence. And now, through tongues once lost to ice and rot, they were learning how to speak again.
There are voices that rise in prayer, and there are voices that rise from places where prayers have long since died. The first time they heard her, the wind had been still. No bells, no chanting, only a single, trembling voice, singing. It came from the far end of the cemetery, from where the old graves bent under twisted trees, where the frost never quite melted, and the air felt heavy with things unsaid. The melody was not joyful, not sad either. It moved like water in darkness, slow, echoing, strange. At first they thought it was the wind, but the sound carried tone, shape, breath. And when someone sang in Jumra Pass, you could feel it in your teeth. The song had no words, or perhaps it had too many, layered one over another, woven so tightly together that meaning bled into rhythm. But the hosts recognized it. They stood at attention. They turned their heads east, and some wept. Not from pain, but recognition. "That's the sound," one whispered, "that used to wake the soil." The next night, the voice returned, clearer this time, louder. It didn't echo, it didn't wander. It rose straight from the earth like steam, curling into the still air, inviting the night to listen. The villagers began gathering near the ridge, not close, just close enough to hear. And there, seated atop a broken grave, was a figure wrapped in dark wool and shadow. A woman, or what used to be one. No one had seen her arrive, no trail in the snow, no footprints. She didn't look at them, she didn't move, only she sang, eyes closed, hands folded over her lap, body as still as stone. Her skin was gray like ash, her lips cracked, and yet her voice carried a strength that bent the cold around it. They called her the Grave Singer, and from that night on, she never left. Each evening, as the sky bruised purple and the last light disappeared behind the cliffs, she began her song, always the same melody, always the same stillness. The hosts responded in kind. They would sit at the cemetery's edge in rows, not facing her, but the graves. They swayed in time with her voice, heads tilted slightly, like leaves drifting in slow wind. Amanyima tried speaking to her once. She approached with incense and an offering of barley bread. But the grave singer did not acknowledge her, not even a blink, only the song. It wasn't a refusal, it wasn't rudeness, it was devotion to something far older than human interaction. Later that night,
Amanyima described the encounter. It felt like standing before a shrine that had never been named, something not meant to be worshipped, but obeyed. Soon the children began humming her melody in their sleep, even those who had never heard it. Elders who had forgotten their own names whispered the tune between breaths, and newborns moved their mouths in sync with it before they learned to speak. The song had become a thread, winding through every home, every host, every silence. And with it came something else, dreams. They were not nightmares. They were not memories. They were instructions. Dreams of preparing the ground, of laying stones in circles, of painting faces with ash and standing barefoot before graves that glowed with pale light. The villagers stopped resisting. They began placing offerings at their doorsteps each night, bits of honey, folded prayer flags, locks of hair wrapped in cloth, not for the dead, not for gods, for the singer, because somehow she had become the voice of all that had been buried. One host, a boy of 13, said it best. "She's not singing to us, she's singing through us." And then, for the first time, the song changed. One night, her voice faltered just for a moment. A single note, off, lower, deeper, and every host in the village screamed in unison. They fell to their knees, clutching their heads. Some bled from their ears, some convulsed, some whispered, "It's too early." The song ended, and the grave singer vanished, gone before sunrise. No body, no sound, only silence, heavy, hollow. For 3 nights the village held its breath, no bells, no voices, no dreams. But on the 4th night, a new sound emerged from the cemetery. Not singing, drumming, the rhythm of feet, the sound of many hands patting soil, calling it back into shape. And then the grave singer returned, but not alone. Beside her stood 7 figures, shrouded, still, each with a bell where their mouth should be. And the song began again. This time it echoed, because now it was a choir. Once it was just a bell, tied with string, lowered gently into the ground beside the dead, an act of mercy, a thread between breath and silence, between the living and what might still be alive beneath. But not anymore. The string was gone, and the bells were ringing anyway. At first, the villagers thought it symbolic, a haunting echo of an old tradition, manifesting through fear and memory. They searched the graves, dug up half-buried relics, prayed over coffins that no longer held the dead they once buried. But no matter how carefully they examined the earth, there were no strings, just the bells, ringing, shining, clean as if newly forged. Some weren't even metal. They were made of bone, glass, something that shimmered like melted ice and flickered when touched. Amanyima sat one evening in the center of the cemetery, surrounded by graves, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. She let the bells ring around her, a low, irregular harmony that filled the air like drifting smoke. When she opened her eyes, she whispered, "The bells aren't waiting for us to tie them. We're the ones being tied now. We're the string." It made too much sense, because the bells no longer needed hands to move. They no longer needed rope. They rang from inside the trees, inside the soil, inside people. One woman, a host named Kelsang, began to cough uncontrollably. Not from illness. Her throat was clear, her lungs were strong. But each time she coughed, it sounded like metal. She was examined. No bell. Until she opened her mouth in the dark, and a small chime echoed from the hollow of her throat. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. She wept not from pain, but from relief. "It's finally in me," she said. "I don't have to carry it anymore. It carries me now." Her words were not her own, and she never spoke again. From that day forward, some hosts carried the bell inside them. Their breaths echoed faintly. Their footsteps left no sound, but still resonated. They had become instruments. And when they walked, it was not for sleep, it was for signal. One night the villagers gathered near the ridge after hearing a strange hum. Not melody, not voice, just vibration. Felt in the ribs, heard in the blood. At the center of the cemetery stood 3 hosts. They were not moving, but they were ringing. From inside. Soft tones pulsing like heartbeat. One high, one low, one impossibly deep, almost below sound. They were in perfect harmony, and above them in the sky, clouds began to spiral. Slow, deliberate, as if even the air had become tuned. Then the grave singer joined them. Her song began without warning. This time, her voice was different, no longer solitary, no longer mournful. It was instructional, a call, a trigger. Every host in the village stopped what they were doing, mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-thought, and turned toward the sound. They moved not in unison, but in rhythm. Some began to dig, not graves, but patterns, circles, spirals, channels in the dirt that had no meaning until seen from above. Then they made altars, not of stone or wood, but of bells. Dozens of them. No strings, no ropes, just bells resting on soil, humming faintly, as if already aware of their role. Amanima stood among them, tears streaking her ash-painted face, not from sorrow, but from awe. She whispered, "They've built their own ritual, one that doesn't need our permission, one that doesn't need our hands." The hosts worked through the night. By dawn, the village had changed. The cemetery no longer looked like a resting place. It looked like a machine, a mechanism of memory, a design in the dirt, pulsing with the faint chime of hundreds of untethered bells. Nawang, exhausted, knelt beside one of the hosts and asked gently, "What are you building?" The host turned, eyes hollow, voice distant. "It is a resonance to remind the world that we were never meant to be still." He placed a bell into Nawang's hand. It was warm, and it beat like a heart. That night, no one tied bells to graves. No one whispered over corpses. No one feared the 3rd night, because the bells no longer waited for death. They had found their voices, and they were ringing for the living now. I used to think the ringing came from somewhere else, from beneath the soil, from the mouths of hosts, from the trees, from the sky. But now I know the truth. It was never out there. It was inside me. It began with a pulse, a tiny vibration in my chest, like the flutter of a moth trapped between ribs. It wasn't painful, just present, constant. A soft, rhythmic thrum I could feel only in silence, only when I was alone. At first, I thought it was anxiety, grief, the weight of watching too many faces go hollow, too many names vanish into dirt. But the sound didn't fade. It grew. It spread from my chest to my throat, to the bones in my ears, to my teeth, until every breath I took was laced with a faint chime, not heard, but sensed. I told no one, not even Amanima, not at first, because I knew what it meant. I had seen the signs in others, the distant gaze, the stillness, the way their shadows began to move slower than their bodies, and I was beginning to slow too. Sleep became slippery. I would lie down and close my eyes and wake up in strange places, sitting beneath the temple stairs, kneeling in front of graves I didn't recognize, fingers curled around invisible offerings. Once, I woke with a stone bell cradled in my hands. It had no clapper, but when I touched it, it rang. I wasn't alone anymore. Not in my skin, not in my silence. Something had found its way in, and it was gentle. It didn't take over. It didn't speak in my voice. It waited, like a passenger who bought a one-way ticket and knew the road ahead better than I did. I began to remember things I had never seen. Mountains before they had names. Graves marked not by stones, but by stacked hands. Ceremonies performed in darkness, where bells were rung not for mourning, but for summoning. I saw myself in those memories, not as who I am now, but as someone else. Someone who once walked into the earth willingly and asked to be buried. And I understood. The bell wasn't calling to me. It was calling me back. Back to what I had been. Back to the rhythm that had been waiting inside my bones for centuries. When I finally told Amanima, she didn't cry, she didn't gasp. She simply placed her hand over my heart and listened. And then she nodded. It's ringing true now. You're ready. I asked her what that meant. She said nothing, only handed me a spool of black thread. No instructions, just thread. I knew what to do. That night I walked the village in silence, tied small bells to door handles, to tree branches, to my own wrists. I wanted them to hear me coming, to know I was still here, still me, for now. And yet the deeper I walked into the cemetery, the lighter I felt. The bell inside me pulsed in time with the wind, with the snow, with the faint singing that rose once again from the grave singer's place at the ridge. I joined her. I didn't mean to. My feet moved on their own, not with force, with remembrance. She didn't turn to look at me. She didn't need to. She knew I was hers now. I sat beside her, closed my eyes, and sang, not with my voice, with my memory. And in that song I felt everything I had forgotten. The soil, the rituals, the names, the first time I died, and the second, and the third. Because death wasn't a wall, it was a circle, and I was always meant to return. I woke just before dawn, snow on my shoulders, frost on my lips, a bell resting in my open hand, small, silver, still warm. I placed it in my pocket, walked back to the village. No one spoke to me. No one had to. They saw the difference. In my eyes, in my steps, in the chime that followed me even when I didn't move. I was not a host, not anymore. I was something else, a carrier, a memory, a bell wrapped in skin. And I knew one day soon I could not stay, because the bell inside me was growing louder, and soon it would ring on its own. And when it did, someone else would hear it, someone like me, and they would follow. Not out of fear, not out of grief, but because they too would remember that the bell does not wait for permission. It rings because the earth still remembers your name, even when you forget it yourself.
There was a time when the bell rang for mercy. Then it rang for memory. And now it rings for you. Not to warn, not to mourn, but to invite. No longer does Jumra Pass pretend the dead are gone. The village is quiet now, not from fear, but from understanding, from surrender. Everyone knows the rhythm. Everyone feels the pull. It doesn't come with screaming. It doesn't come with flames. It comes with stillness, with a chime in the chest, a whisper in the dark. And when it comes, you don't ask, "Why me?" You whisper, "It's time." Because the bells are not instruments of death. They are keys. And someone has opened the door. The hosts no longer hide. They walk freely through the village, their skin pale, their breath shallow, their eyes filled with places no one else can see. When they pass, the wind carries their scent, not of decay, but of soil, incense, and snow. They speak less now, but when they do, their words are chosen carefully. You'll know when it's time, when you hear your own name in the chime, when your dreams smell like earth, when your shadow doesn't follow you anymore. These aren't prophecies. They are instructions. And one by one, the villagers begin to understand them. They begin packing small offerings, a bell, a strand of hair, a name written in salt. They do not plan for burial anymore. They plan for arrival. Because they've stopped fearing the graves, they've started walking toward them. The bells no longer wait for the third night. They ring when they choose, sometimes in the morning, sometimes at dusk, sometimes inside someone's pocket, with no wind, no movement, just sound. When a bell rings now, the village stops. Everyone listens, not in terror, in recognition, because it's never random. It always rings for someone. And when it does, that person walks. Voluntarily, alone, without fear. They take the same path, past the temple, past the cedar tree, past the old landslide scars, to the ridge, to the graves, to her. The grave singer waits, still, timeless, eternal. She doesn't welcome them with words, she sings. And when the melody reaches them, They kneel. They close their eyes. They place their bell beside her, and they vanish. No death, no body, just absence. And a new name etched in frost the next morning. The villagers began calling it the calling, but the hosts have another name, the answer. Because they say, the bell does not ask, it already knows. It rings for those who are ready, ready to stop running, ready to return to what they once were, ready to become remembered. The invitation is simple. It does not beg, it does not chase. It waits, and it finds you. In your silence, in your dreams, in the way your fingers twitch when no one's watching. You won't hear it first with your ears. You'll feel it. A hum in your spine. A pressure in your chest. A faint echo every time you speak your name. And when you're ready, you'll know. Because the bell will ring without cause, and it will sound like home. Amma Nima was the last of the old ones to walk. She stood in the center of the village one morning, wrapped in black, her eyes brighter than they had been in years. She spoke to no one, but all understood. She walked to the ridge with steady steps, her bell in hand. She did not cry, she did not look back. And when she reached the circle of hosts, she placed her bell at the center, then turned to the village one last time. It's not for the dead, she said softly. It never was. It's always been an invitation for the living to remember who we were and to come back. Then she closed her eyes and was gone. Only the bell remained, still, silent, until dusk. And then it rang, once, and every soul in the village heard it from inside.
Jumra Pass is quiet now. Not the quiet of abandonment, not the silence of death, but the stillness of something complete. There are no screams, no questions, only snow falling gently on rooftops that no longer shelter the living, because the living are no longer here. They walked, one by one, not in panic, not in terror, but in understanding, in surrender, in return. There was no announcement, no final gathering, no farewell, just bells, soft, distant, constant, ringing not from the ground, but from within. The grave singer still sits beneath the ash-colored tree. Her song has slowed. Her voice is thinner now, but somehow deeper. She is not calling anymore. She is receiving. The hosts, if they can still be called that, are no longer separate. They do not wait for dreams. They do not wait for night. They are part of the soil now, part of the sky. They do not speak because they do not need to. They are heard everywhere. You can still walk the village. You'll see the doors are open, tables set for meals never eaten, shoes left by the fire. But no one will greet you. No one will ask why you've come, because they already know. If you've made it this far, if you've followed the bells, if you've heard the name buried deep beneath your ribs, then you weren't looking for the village. You were looking for where it went, and now you found it. The houses have not decayed. The paths are swept clean by wind. The names are still written in ash on the doorframes. And the cemetery? It's no longer separate. It is the village now. Each home has become a grave. Each grave a doorway. Each bell a welcome. Because Jumra Pass did not fall. It did not vanish. It did not die. It buried itself on purpose, with reverence, with love, to become what it had always been becoming, a memory, a vessel, a ringing invitation for anyone who no longer knows whether they are awake or walking. And when you stand in the center of the village, snow brushing your shoulders, your breath curling into a wind that does not move, you will hear it, soft, clear, the faint sound of a bell, not outside you, inside. And you'll know it has remembered your name, and you are being called home.